Happy Sunday, LBE community. And because it is a Sunday and we are coming to you live, you must know if you are one of our regular viewers that we are about to bring you a hot topic. Um, the hot topic is not an unfamiliar topic, voter suppression, uh, Oklahoma's recent passing of a bill against protesters, and it all just comes down to voter suppression, which typically affects those of us who are people who identify as being Black and or of African descent or African American. And so, Sister Kara, here we are for a Hot Topic Sunday. How are you today?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Good. I'm happy to see you. What do you think about this topic?
I am very eager to get into this one. We are going to have a lot of good stuff to cover in this conversation.
Yes. And so, audience, as usual, please post those questions. Our guest presenter will be open to a Q&A after the presentation. And so, with all of that being said, I'm really looking forward to this discussion as well. Sister Kara, take it away.
All right. Well, as always, thank you all for joining us today. We know that you are joining us from here in Flagstaff, across Arizona, across the country, and even some viewers across the world. So we appreciate your time and your engagement with this conversation. Giving our presentation today will be Representative Monroe Nichols of District 72 in Tulsa, Oklahoma. In 2016, Representative Monroe Nichols became the first African American elected to represent House District 72 in the Oklahoma House of Representatives. During his time in the legislature, Representative Nichols has authored legislation focused on providing all students with a high-quality education, all Oklahomans with access to health care services, ensuring Oklahoma's economic works for everyone, revitalizing neighborhoods, and reforming the justice system. In 2014, he co-founded Impulse Tulsa, a collective impact organization aimed at improving education for all Tulsa area students. From 2014 to 2016, Representative Nichols also served on the Tulsa Technology Center Board of Education. In 2017, he was elected to serve as House Democratic Caucus Vice Chair. In addition to his legislative service, Representative Nichols is the Director of Network Growth for Strive Together, a leading national nonprofit focused on advancing equity to improve student outcomes in communities across the country. Over the course of his career, Representative Nichols has been the recipient of several awards, including the United States Department of Justice Award for Public Service. He holds a bachelor's degree in political science and economics from the University of Tulsa and a master's in public administration from the University of Oklahoma. Welcome, Representative Nichols.
I am super excited to be here. It's always kind of funny to hear your bio being read. It's kind of one of those things where you hear it and you remember old things, but also it's kind of funny to sit here and listen to that. The other thing is, I know my mother has spent some time with you all before. So I'm just going to go ahead and let everybody know who saw Ramona Curtis a few weeks ago. She's going to be far more impressive than I am. So I'm going to apologize for that off top, but I'm really excited to be here.
Well, thank you for joining us today. We look forward to hearing what you share with us. And with that, I hand the conversation over to you.
Yeah, sure. Again, thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here with everybody virtually, the way in which we've all learned now to gather to really talk about a couple really important issues, not only facing the Black community, but I think facing all communities, things that we should all be incredibly concerned about. There's been a troubling trend across the country in a number of areas, but I think two really have been elevated here recently, and rightfully so. One is the wave of anti-protester legislation that we see moving through states across the country. Then on the other end, an issue that I know most folks are have really been dug into, which is the voter suppression laws we're seeing across the country, which are getting a lot more attention, and rightfully so. The Major League Baseball's with the All-Star game, those types of things. So super important pieces of legislation. I think what is important about those two is when we see the connectivity between the two of them, right? 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, it elevated the issue of the need for police reform. We saw citizens take to the streets across the country. My home here in Tulsa, Oklahoma, being a city where we saw a wave of protest, all of which were peaceful, but not without incident, right? And so there's that, and then there's what we've learned around folks really doing things we haven't done in a long time, which is changing places like Arizona, like Georgia, blue. And we would think and we would hope that the lesson learned there is that there's a need for systemic change, right? On one end, on the protester side, let's get to the heart of the issue around police reform, and I'll share a couple of ideas that we've been working on in Oklahoma in just a second. And then on the other end, we see these examples where citizens don't like the direction of the country, and they do what it is we teach everybody to do, which is to go and vote, to exercise that right to vote. And instead of politicians being responsive to the needs of a new direction, far too many of them have decided what they would rather do is just change the rules around voting. So really looking forward to the conversation around those two things, and anything else that's on folks' mind. But I'll quickly top line a pretty concerning piece of legislation that was brought up there at the top. I think it's been even in the topic so far, and that's House Bill 1674, which really was designed to grant immunity to drivers who injure or kill protesters, right? The legislation says it grants immunity to drivers who unintentionally do this, right? It also states that to unlawfully obstruct any street in Oklahoma means you can be charged a misdemeanor or $5,000 in fines. Now, when you hear that, you hear the unintentional killing or injuring of somebody, there might be some folks that say, oh, well, that's not bad. You didn't intend to do it, right? The thing that I always point out is I've not seen one example anywhere in the country where someone who unintentionally injured or killed somebody in that same situation has been prosecuted, right? So we got to think about, why are these things designed and worded like the way they are? They are intended to intimidate protesters. They are intended to take folks who are on the other side of this conversation and really give them some false sense of control and I think supreme being over those folks who are protesting, right? We had a situation in Tulsa, Oklahoma this year where an individual in a truck drove through some protesters. There was a young man, I believe, who was paralyzed because of it. The driver was not prosecuted, right? The DA did not prosecute him. And so when I asked the author of the bill that very same question, well, what's the need? Where's the growing need for this if we know folks already have this protection in law? He couldn't give me a great answer. His true answer, I would imagine, is this is a way for us to really dig into this idea that we don't want people exercising their First Amendment right. And we want to make sure that people, when they do it, are doing it in fear. And I talked about on the House floor how tough it was for me as a father to go back to my son and say, hey, I know you learned a lot of stuff as a 12-year-old last year. And what I know you would hope is that the folks in power would take a crack at some of those systemic issues to almost take away the reasons for folks to be in the street, as opposed to giving immunity for folks who would run over those folks in the street. And one other thing I'll draw out, there's two things that I think are super important in the context of this conversation, is that this isn't new, right? George Wallace, who, if people don't know, was one of the premier segregationists in the 1960s. He was the governor of Georgia. And George Wallace, actually, way back in those days, had a quote where he said, if any protester lays down in front of my car, it'll be the last car he'll ever lay down in front of, right? And so these laws are actually in the spirit of and designed from, segregation in the 1960s. Like, this isn't nothing new, which is really sad that we're still dealing with these types of things in 2021. And the second piece I'll leave you with before we get into a deeper discussion and talk a little bit about some of the police reform ideas we've put forward. The only person who I can think of who's been prosecuted in this case, and I'm sure there's probably others, but it's James Alex Fields. And if people don't remember who that is, that was the 32-year-old white supremacist that killed Heather Heyer and injured 19 people in Charlottesville. And it was called an act of domestic terrorism. And so what I truly believe about House Bill 1674, in the spirit of House Bill 1674, is it is a nod to the kind of domestic terrorism that killed 1 and injured 19 in Charlottesville, which is the reason why it's so important that we're having this conversation and others. And finally, I'm going to top line just some police reform ideas that we've introduced in Oklahoma and continue to work for, because I don't want people listening to think that, hey, we're just calling a foul when we see things we don't like. We have offered up some legitimate solutions to the issues that we see in our community. We've offered up solutions that would have the Attorney General take a stronger role in investigating uses of deadly force. We know that transparency is always an issue, and so we had some legislation that require the Attorney General to produce a report on all investigations dealing with deadly force, an issue we've actually dealt with here in Tulsa a number of different times. The idea that we would create a police practices unit within the AG's office to review police training and provide recommendations for improvement. One of the issues we hear all the time is that police training is the reason why officers behave in certain ways. And so if that's the issue, then we really need to do our best to say, take a deeper look at, hey, what's going on in police training that's given us the result where people of color not only feel that there's a disparity in in the administration of justice, but we know it because of data, arrest numbers, things like that, right? And then the last couple of things from some of the reform efforts that we've offered up, and there's a number of others, but there's a couple that directed the AG to keep a database of disciplinary actions taken against police officers for misconduct, and keep that database updated so law enforcement agencies could look at that when they're making hiring decisions, so that somebody who may have been a bad actor, other law enforcement agencies know that before making a hire. And so we really feel like what we've offered up in the way of solutions are not anti-police solutions, right? These are solutions that help law enforcement, just like they help the community, and that help us all get to a place where we can better understand how to keep communities safe, and frankly, cut down on the reasons why people are taken to the streets by dealing with the systemic issues that take them there. I think the same can be said on the voter suppression side, but I'm really excited about the conversation today and answering everybody's questions. But I think if nothing else, I know some of us across the country felt a little sigh of relief after the results of the presidential election. But I hope the conversation we'll have today about anti-protester bills, about voter suppression pieces of legislation, I hope what comes out today is that folks take a harder and stronger look and say the work is not done when you elect Joe Biden for president. The work is not done then. The work has to be done every day, because these pieces of legislation that we're going to talk about today and the wave and the trend of them are happening in state houses. And so, it's not just about who gets elected in Washington. Our elections are decided by the people who get elected in your community. And that's the conversation that we have to have. And so don't think for one second that the voter suppression laws are just all about winning the next presidential election. It's about ensuring that they reduce the tone, reduce the volume of the voice of the people so they can continue business as usual. And that's something we all should be concerned about. And so I want to say how great it is to be having this conversation. And I'm so thankful you all have added this as part of your dialogue series, because I can't think of too many more important things that we should be talking about.
Well, thank you very much, Representative Nichols, for that introduction to our topic and the review of some of what's happening in Oklahoma specifically to address these topics. Before we launch into our Q&A, I want to quickly share some of the other news that's going throughout the country that's focusing in on these various bills that are aimed at anti-protest legislation. Just yesterday, there were protests in Cleveland, Ohio, in opposition to Senate Bills 16 and 41 and House Bills 22 and 109, all of which were imposing major fines for so-called inciting to violence, aggravated riots, and riotous sorts of acts, inclusion of certain vandalism conduct within conspiracy penalties, and charges that are basically being listed out as these are the potential fines if you are associated in any way with some of these acts. In Georgia, there was Senate Bill 1, which was voted down, and that was a bill that would have labeled certain activity intended to advance any ideology or belief as domestic terrorism, which is something that we'll come back to in Q&A to talk about what are the implications of that. They also passed Senate Bill 160, a Back the Badge bill with a stripping of its anti-protester language. In Tennessee, there was Senate Bill 944, which died in session and would have, similar to the Oklahoma bill, immunized drivers who accidentally hit a protester on a roadway. In Florida, there was a bill that also died in session that would have criminalized protesters obstructing traffic and exempted drivers from liability if they struck a protester under certain circumstances. And that was being referred to as a hit and kill bill.
Yep.
On Friday, there were reports of a bill, I believe it was House Bill 1, being considered directly connected to opposition to Black Lives Matter protests in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, when Governor Ron DeSantis specifically cited the vandalism of a statue of Christopher Columbus, which under this bill will be considered a felony under the law. The bill is noted as having language that infringes upon the rights of citizens to peacefully protest and subject peaceful protesters to punishment for crimes they simply happen to be present for.
Right.
In Oklahoma, there was a bill, HB 1123, which punishes protesters who willfully trespass on critical infrastructure with up to a $1 million fine on any organization found to be a conspirator in such trespass, and Oklahoma House Bill 2128, which appears to make anyone merely arrested for trespass liable for any damages to property caused while trespassing. Here in Arizona, we also had a bill, Senate Bill 1142, which died in session, that would have made participation in or organizing a protest that, quote, turns into a riot, a criminal racketeering offense, and enabled police to seize the assets of anyone involved in a protest that at some point becomes violent, enabling prosecutors to charge individuals who weren't even involved in the riot.
That's right.
So obviously, we have a lot of these sorts of bills coming out across the country. Oklahoma has a very interesting perspective on some of these sorts of legislation. In particular, what I found interesting, and this will launch us right into our first question, was Oklahoma's definition of a riot. For those who don't know, under Oklahoma statute Title 21, a riot is very broadly defined as any use of force or violence or any threat to use force or violence if accompanied by immediate power of execution by 3 or more persons acting together and without authority of law. Now, I'd love to hear your opinions on that definition as we start.
Yeah, so many things. It's just going through those number of bills in Oklahoma and across the country, and just listening to them, they make your stomach hurt a little bit. But here's the deal. I mean, I think that's the point, right? To make these things very broad, so that you can intimidate folks when they're trying to make their voices heard. So if that's the case, then you don't want anything narrowly defined. You want it big and broad, right? So you can charge folks with things. And for me, I think the thing that always hits me in the face in relation to not only how we define a riot, but the ways in which we decide to go after people who just might be kind of semi-involved as they were around at the time, or maybe they help plan. Or I think in some of these bills, we talked about they've talked a lot about giving out water at voting places, but I guarantee you the way a lot of these bills are defined, if people are protesting and you give them some water, then you are, probably considered to be an organizer of said event. And so I think the goal with all that is just to make it to where folks, they believe there is a disincentive to be there, because an officer, a DA, anybody could define what they're doing as rioting. And quite frankly, we've seen what a riot looks like at the U.S. Capitol. You didn't see those kind of things happening last spring and summer in the wake of George Floyd. I heard a lot of people say, "Oh, they're burning down cities and all this kind of stuff," which just was not true. I mean, surely when you have a gathering of folks, there's a chance that things might go wrong, but there weren't officers who were injured. There weren't people who were injured. These were not violent protests, and so they were not riots. And so maybe in the law we need to, determine what's a violent riot versus is a gathering of folks who are protesting and exercising their First Amendment right. Because what I saw all last summer was not what I would consider to be riots, but by the definition you just read me, probably by the letter of that title in state statute, could be considered to be just that. And the folks who were there wouldn't characterize them that way at all. We didn't have riots this summer. We had very energetic protest, and I think the difference in the distinction between the two is there was no violence this summer. With all the folks in all the cities across the country, violence just wasn't something that we were interested in, involved in.
Can I jump in with a question, Brother Representative? Over the summer here, last summer during our protest, the police officers were handing out water,
right,
to the protesters. Remember that, Sister Kara?
Yes.
So, how does this new bill affect, us here in little old Flagstaff? We, small community. We come out and we, bring our signs and our flags, what have you, and the police officers give us water.
Right.
So where are we heading?
I'll tell you, there were police officers who were off duty who marched and protested this summer, right? For the most part, the relationship between police and protesters, and everywhere that I saw, was pretty cordial. There were some instances where, riot gear came out and that kind of stuff that always raises the tone and tenor. But for the ones that I attended, even when there were folks that were having a chance around defunding the police and all that kind of stuff, I mean, law enforcement, for the most part, there was no threat to them, right? And a lot of them were part of those protests, largely because I think so many of them know it does not do a police officer who shows up every day, who does his or her job right every day. It does them no good to have bad actors in the profession, because that makes everybody look bad, and frankly, it makes their job more dangerous. I don't know. I don't think I shared in this particular gathering so far. My dad was a police officer before he passed away. My uncle's still a police officer in Dallas, Texas. Even with all the police reform legislation that I work on, I am not anti-police. A lot of my best friends are police officers, and they're great at what they do. I believe them to be heroes. When I call 911, they come my direction when everybody else is running the other direction. And so it is a profession that we should always be extremely proud of, but no profession is above being held accountable. And so I think when you see police officers who are handing out water, police officers that are joining these protests, well, they're definitely not anti-police, but they understand the growing call and the need to make sure that we hold their profession accountable, just like my profession is held accountable, just like any profession is held accountable. And in all the law enforcement reform that we've done over the years, it is typically around like pensions and officer pay. We really have not had a conversation from a public policy standpoint about how training needs to be different, uniform code of conduct for police officers across the country, what to do with bad actors in the profession. So I think what your experience was my experience largely in Tulsa with the cooperation from folks in law enforcement. Yeah, I'm sure it's tough for them to hear some of the chants. I'm sure it's really tough for them to have to sit in both worlds. But I think if you were to ask them, they would tell you, yeah, we have to change. We have to change, and we have a great community outreach department here at the Tulsa Police Department that one of my old teammates from college works on. He's a police officer. He does community outreach work. They do fantastic work, right? But they also recognize, because the way in which we address reform, because some of these bills that we see across the country, that there's a significant trust deficit between folks in the community and folks who wear the badge. And if we can do more, I think that goes away.
But won't these new laws, sounds like it's a setup that will prohibit police officers from protesting on off duty, handing out water. I mean, what does that really mean? Just for police officers for during future protests.
I mean, not good, right? It puts you in an awful position as a police officer, no matter which side of this that you're on. And so if you want to be involved in those things, obviously you can't, because you can't knowingly break a law, right? But you have to be there in some way, because if somebody is quote unquote breaking the law, then you're the person who comes to deal with that kind of stuff. I think what it does is it just continues to muddy the water, which is why when we had the whole conversation about this bill and others, these bills typically don't come because law enforcement has asked somebody to run the bill. These bills don't come because people really think they're going to solve a problem. These bills come from folks who have a worldview and experience that's far different from the folks who are most impacted, but they don't reach out to those people, right? They don't reach out to folks and say, hey, how is it that we have a safer community, that maybe we don't have protests and those types? They don't want to know the answer to that. What they want to be able to say is, look, I'm dealing with those knucklehead protesters by cracking down on them and making it harder for them to assemble, to make the environment more dangerous for them and those types of things. And so these bills are so ill-conceived because of the place that they come from, right? They come from a really dark and offensive, I think, in a very prejudiced and racist place, which is the reason why they all are so inferior in dealing with the underlying problem. And frankly, they're so inferior in even dealing with the issues which law enforcement officers would tell them in a second are the real underlying issues and things that need to be dealt with. And so, my hat's off to the police officers there in Flagstaff that were handing out water and doing those kind of things. Because those things, what do they do? They help build trust. It helps give us some idea that we're all in this together, which is a huge difference between that kind of behavior and the kind of legislation that we see introduced in state houses across the country. I think it's a lot of folks trying to win political primaries. And what they are doing is they're making my community and yours more dangerous, both for police officers and more dangerous for folks in the community that are concerned about issues. To be quite honest, it's possible with some of these protester bills. I don't know how somebody would recognize if they, quote unquote, thought they had immunity. How do they recognize an off-duty police officer who might be amongst the crowd, right? So these things aren't safe for people. Not the people in the car, people protesting. They're not safe in how we all interact with police. These bills just really exist to drum up the same kind of attitudes that I read about with George Wallace's quote from the 1960s. John Lewis, who was a hero of mine, cut his teeth protesting, cut his teeth on that bridge in Selma. And I would imagine that there's a lot of folks who then felt like the way to deal with protesters like John Lewis and others was to hit them in the head and sick dogs on them and all that kind of stuff, as opposed to passing the Civil Rights Act, as opposed to ensuring that the Voting Rights Act passed the finish line. When we start to make that progress as a country, well, what happened? We had fewer protests, right? So if we dealt with those structures, those systemic issues, there wouldn't be a need to protest as much. And so I'm certainly glad that John Lewis and others were willing to bleed and die, even though, frankly, folks would have thought that's the way you deal with it back then. And I fear that we're having a lot of that same playbook is starting to creep into our politics, into our civic society in 2021.
Exactly, and that's another question that I have, and then I've done for a bit, but so we're sitting right now in the midst of this trial for so-called Officer Coven, who simply assassinated Brother George Floyd. So I would anticipate that the summer, or whenever this trial ends, will bring about some protest from Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter movement. With these new laws, I guess we're looking at possibly more deaths of people who just want to get out and express themselves. I mean, are we in a place now where we no longer have the right to protest in America?
I think that's the goal, right? It's because people don't want progress. Progress has came through protests for a long time in this country, and we know that to be true. Whether we're talking about civil rights, voting rights, women's rights, whatever it might be, it came from folks taking to the street. I remember after President Trump was elected, we had women's marches all across the country, right? And so folks understand. We understand in this country then we want things to change. Part of it is our obligation to get out there and do our part to change them. Often often protest is the way that we do it, because it shows a collective voice toward a set of ideas that we were supposed to be committed to as a country. And so, like, for me, I think it's not only offensive, but it is pretty anti-American to have these kind of laws there. And they also don't go well with, I'm from Waco, Texas originally, and Baylor University just won the NCAA championship. And I saw some videos from Waco, Texas, a lot of students in the streets blocking traffic because they were celebrating, right? Even under the way in which that you read what a riot looks like, that could have potentially been considered a riot, right? And we don't think about it that way. Because they're having fun, they're harmless, their kids. I guarantee you the potential damage that's done when a bunch of kids get out on the street far exceeds the kind of damage that was done in a significant number of the protests this summer. And so with this, again, what this really is, it's really going after the fact that power wants to maintain power. And we're starting to see a trend in this country where folks who may have not been as involved in the process before, whether that be taken to the streets to protest or voting, those folks are starting to make their voices heard. It makes some people in power uncomfortable, and that's why we see what we see. When I wish that the lesson that they would take, it's definitely a lesson that I took from what I saw over the last year, is that we have some real systemic issues in this country. It's just not working for a lot of folks, and we can fix those things. Just like you talked about the wave of legislation around voter suppression and around anti-protester bills, imagine if that was a wave of legislation that was being passed in state houses across the country dealing with the issue of police reform, dealing with the issue of ensuring that we weren't trying to cut people out of the ballot box, but trying to make sure that more people could participate. What it does for us as a country would be something unlike. It's the only thing we've never tried before, right? We always have this tendency in America to, as soon as change hits us, the old guard tries to pull that all back, tries to rein that all in, as opposed to embracing the direction in which we are to go. So I think the good thing is that we will get there. Progress always wins, right? It always wins. But they understand that the way to slow progress down is to say, you make it harder to protest, make it harder to vote. And so I hope what our response to this is not just anger and outrage, but it is almost kind of a, re-energizing our efforts around protests when we see something that needs to be protested. It re-energize our efforts to go out and vote because we care about our communities.
Yeah, I think that brings up a really important question in terms of the nature of the legislation that we're seeing coming about, right? You see the comment that was just highlighted on the screen that protesting is a part of American history. Protests made way for the American Revolution, women's suffrage, etc. And what I find interesting in so much of the legislation that's coming up now is you have legislators who are specifically saying this bill is in response to the Black Lives Matter protests.
Right.
This bill is in response to the protests surrounding the death of George Floyd. So what does that tell us about the nature of this legislation? Who is it aimed at really hindering in terms of protests and their ability to protest?
I mean, it's 100% aimed at Black folks. There's no doubt about it, right? And what's really interesting, as you were talking about, is that there's very little in the way of trying to hide that fact, right? We have gotten to a point where we have folks who are so emboldened that not only are they willing to pass these pieces of legislation, but they're willing to, even in their comments, and I think it is another form of intimidation, say this is aimed at you, very specifically at you. And I think it's true what you said before, and it's why I said it just a bit ago. We understand that protest is the way that things change, and so when we talk about a more equitable country, right? When we talk about true equality as Americans, that's what this pushback is for, and that's what it's against, right? And because there's no way otherwise that you say these states where people of color really turned out to change the course of American politics, at least in this term. Why those places? Why are those places the places we're focused on voter suppression laws? What about states that Republicans have won and done really well? And why are we focused on those areas as well? That's because they're really concerned about the powerful collection of not only people of color, but also, white folks who feel the very same way. This is to say, no, we're not ready for that, right? We're not ready for that. But I hope that people of color continue to work really hard toward this, because this is an attack of people who look like you and me. That's who these pieces of legislation it's aimed at attacking. And as I said before, again, that speaks to where it comes from, right? This is the same playbook used in the 60s that is all about rolling back the rights or preventing the progression of rights for people of color who really want that equal seat at the table in this country and in communities across this country.
Yeah, and to highlight these questions that are coming into the chat about, what about laws to deal with the January 6th type of behavior? Where are the bills in response to the riot that took place at the United States Capitol on January 6th? Again, I think it calls us back to that question of why, in terms of a peaceful protest, are we now seeing these hundreds of bills across the country aimed specifically at those peaceful protesters versus legislation that's aiming directly at those who committed an act of insurrection and treason at our United States Capitol.
And murdered a police officer. So that's not be lost on us. It's really interesting. You read the Oklahoma bill that really criminalizes any sort of participation or, inciting a riot or whatever the case may be. Under that piece of legislation, I don't think we've had in the House yet. I think it came over from the Senate. Under that piece of legislation, former President Donald Trump would be culpable for that issue in January, for that riot in January, right? And so, I always tell people, you can't have it both ways, But again, as you said before, none of this was designed for that. This was designed for these Black Lives Matter protests. And again, I can't even, I don't even want to think about what happens if the DC Black Lives Matter protests ended up, getting themselves into the Capitol and all that kind of stuff. I don't think that would turn out quite as well, frankly, for people of color like it did for those folks that were there January the 6th. An unfortunate reality for us us Black folks is that for whatever reason, the color of our skin oftentimes makes a lot of folks a lot more nervous. And I can't even imagine that we would get that far as to be able to breach the Capitol building and nobody really be injured by law enforcement, to be totally honest. And so to me, that's a privilege none of us have. That's a privilege that none of us really want. We just want the privilege of living in communities where we're going to have be treated fairly in the eyes of justice, and to be able to show up on election day and have the barriers removed that prevents us from fully making our voices heard. And so, it's really interesting what we're after in this country and what other people are after in this country. Some people want to go back to the good old days. I would argue that the best days are ahead, right? And so these pieces of legislation are really just to pull us back and frankly to hold people like us down, and which is unfortunate, right? I mean, there's a way in which, and I know I have a lot of Republican friends who think like I do, but they don't voice it. They don't voice it because what's at stake is power dynamics, right? What's at stake is position. We need a time in this country where folks care less about their next political job and more about the condition of the people in which they've been sworn to serve. And again, that goes from everything from state legislative seats and city council seats and school board seats, all the way up to the White House of the President of the United States.
Brother Representative, if that were Black folk on January 6th, we would have been dead.
Oh, yeah.
I just feel like I need to put that out there to set the record straight. We all would have been dead. We never would have had the advantage to even accomplish as much as those individuals, which, by the way, some were off-duty police officers, were able to I mean, it's almost inconceivable. Our minds have never, I mean, there is no protest that Black folk have been involved in, and correct me if I'm wrong, that has involved such behavior as we saw, or an executed plan that happened on January 6th.
Yeah, we don't do that. We're looking for largely better schools in our community, right? Like I said,
Right.
equal opportunity in the eyes of justice, equal opportunity in the eyes of employment. Those are the reasons why we protest and why we march, right? And I think that's incredibly offensive for whatever reason to folks in power, right? Our end game is not supremacy. Our end game is equity and equality, and that's a big difference between us and other folks. But it also begs the question of, why is that so hard for us to achieve? Why is that so hard for folks to wrap their head around? And I think for me, that's the most frustrating thing about any of this, right? Is that we aren't here to take something that we weren't already promised. We're not here to try to be supreme over others. We're here just to make this country good on what it promised a long time ago. Which you wouldn't think is too much to ask, but when I look at these pieces of legislation, there's a clear attitude that we don't deserve it.
Right, and I think that's a really interesting point to kind of bounce into the voter suppression bills that are becoming more and more prevalent across the country. That is something major that's been pointed out when it comes to those bills, is that folks are making the argument that it does not hinder people's right to vote. It just makes it harder to cheat, like that sort of language. And what is being pointed out in particular by Black legislators is that these bills are specifically, not only specifically targeting communities of color, but it's also pointing to that history of lack of equitable access, the historical attempts to make it harder for people of color to have equal access two things. And when it comes to the anti-protest bills, that has also been pointed out that so many of these are aimed at particularly people of color not being able to protest. And just saying that, you know, if the law was applied equitably and equally to all people, we wouldn't have these issues. But the fact that it has historically not been applied equitably to people of color and to Black people in particular, that is why these things are an issue. So I'm curious your opinion on that.
Well, I think the first thing you said, like people said, this makes it harder for folks to cheat. I mean, ain't nobody cheating. Who's cheating? Where's the evidence that anybody is cheating? And particularly, where's the evidence of these communities who are forced to sit in long lines and that kind of stuff? Where's the evidence that they are cheating? We're not solving the problem of voter suppression laws because we don't have a problem. The folks who pass these laws have a problem. We don't have a fraud problem. They have a turnout problem. You know, and so that's what I pointed to earlier. Like there's some folks who are really frustrated with the direction of this country. And from the very beginning, the way in which you exercise that right to change the direction of the country is through the ballot box. But they want to take that away. The way in which that we advocate for ourselves for the entire history of this country is by protesting. But they want to take that away. And so we have peaceful protest. We have fair behavior in elections. But what has happened as a result of those is that there's been pressure to deal with the underlying issues on the protest side, right? So we want to crack down on that. And we've changed the face of politics in this term in Washington. And so they want to change that too, with no respect given to the fact of, hey, what these folks really want is reasonable reform on the justice side, right? Common sense reform there. And on this other end, as I mentioned before, people want to go vote because they realize that schools are underfunded in their communities. They realize that the unemployment rates in communities of color is always double that of their counterparts. They realize that in this country, Black wealth is only 10% of that of white wealth. And so they recognize that things are different, not because Black people are less qualified or less skilled. Things are different because the system was built that way. And we need folks that are going to change that system. And that's the reason why we voted as we did. And so instead of being part of the solution, having real conversations with communities of color about those issues, we decided that not only do we not want to talk to them, or they have decided not only do we not want to talk to them, they want to make sure that voice isn't heard at all, which is where the voter suppression laws come from. So, you know, I've always challenged people to say, hey, bring me evidence of voter fraud in these communities. You're not going to find it. Lieutenant Governor in Texas, I think, offered $1 million for any example of voter fraud across the country. He still has his $1 million. And let me tell you, I was almost trying to go find some for him if he got $1 million for somebody, right? But it just doesn't exist. I think Americans, by and large, take the right to vote seriously. I know those of us in communities of color take it incredibly seriously because we have folks who came before us that died for it. And so when you got people who died for it, you're not trying to cheat the system. You're not trying to cheat the system. But if we're teaching young kids that the way in which you participate in a civilized society to change the way in which things go is to vote, but then we tell them, oh, we're going to make it harder for you to do it. Well, then what do you expect to happen, right? What do you expect to happen? And then when we, you know, I'm actually really proud of the fact that, you know, folks who were there on January the 6th are being prosecuted to the full extent of the law. I mean, I sure hope that happens. But, you know, the thing about it is that what kind of privilege do you have to do that in the first place, right? And so, like, you know, for me, I really hope. I think we're going to win. I think over the long haul, some of the voter suppression laws, maybe they'll pass state houses. We'll see how they do in the courts. But I think the more and more you try to quell a unifying message of progress, it's a losing battle in the long haul. And so I do know that we will win. And I'm not just talking about Black people will win. I'm just not talking about white people will win. This country will win because that is how we were founded. This is what is supposed to make us different. And I think we will win that battle. It just may take some time. It'll take some work. But again, we talked about this earlier on. It means that folks have to care about state legislative seats. Don't just show up every 4 years and vote for president. Every time there's an election, you got to be involved. You got to be engaged. That's the only way things change.
Yeah, I want to go back to a point that you made earlier about, where we're seeing these bills pop up, because it's a very interesting thing that I don't feel like a lot of people really pay attention to. And it's the fact that, we're seeing these bills pop up in places that where it can be approved by a simple majority, because a lot of them tend to be Republican-led legislatures that are claiming that this election fraud happened to kick Republicans out of our office. And so because of widespread election fraud on the part of Democrats, these bills are necessary. And I want to kind of hone us in on that fact. So it's Republican-led legislatures saying that fraud was done to perpetuate or to remove Republicans from office from the places where they are, again, leading the legislature. And so we need these bills to prevent that sort of cheating from happening by the folks who did not get them out of office,
right,
according to this supposed fraud. So what does that really tell us about the nature of these sorts of bills? Is it just, wool being pulled over our eyes? Are we not paying attention to what's really happening for folks to be believing that that's the true intention of this?
It is it's a pretty offensive charge to make, right? Because the underlying assumption is only black people cheat when it comes to this, right? The only situation, we got an issue in Atlanta, but we don't have an issue in all these rural parts of Georgia where people are voting for us, right? And so the arrogance there, number one, is just blows me away, and the attitude that people have the audacity to think that the only way they can lose is if other people cheat. It's like, no, if you don't have a message that and an inclusive party for folks and people of color who have real concerns, well, yeah, they're going to vote you out of office. And that's how it's supposed to be. That's how our system is set up. It's a system that we all have agreed works, and it's a system that has worked for a very, very long time. And so for those folks to think that cheating only happens in small portions of the community is wrong. But what it does speak to, though, and this is why we should be really proud, it speaks to the fact that given all the barriers, because Georgia was not the most progressive state as it relates to voting before this. None of these other states were either, because they've tried this kind of stuff for a long time. But what it shows once again is that we as a community, again, are overcoming all these barriers because we care just that much about our community, but we care about other people's community as well. And so on one end, I believe a lot of these voter suppression laws, won't necessarily continue to get in the way of progress because we've overcome them time and time again. But make no mistake about them, they are directed to keep a certain group of people from exercising their right to vote, and in a mission that they have no interest in understanding or addressing the issues that those voters care about. They would just rather make it tougher for them to show up. And I think that's what the lesson is here, is that power structure, they don't want to know what you're concerned about. They don't want to solve any of your problems. They don't want to hear about any of your problems. What they would rather do instead is to make it tougher for you to be able to communicate to everybody else what those problems are, because that brings a little heat on them.
We just had a question come into the chat. How does redistricting play into voter suppression?
Yeah, I mean, that's just something that everybody should be watching. We get the census this year, and so every state will be going through redistricting. We're doing it right now in Oklahoma. How's it impacted? They carve up districts so they can keep majorities, right? So there's a number of these examples. Like Texas had some really egregious examples. We've had some examples of it, obviously, in Oklahoma as well. But this idea that you build these legislative districts in state and congressional districts, people don't realize this. Your state legislatures vote on your congressional districts who you send to Congress, and a lot of times they'll try to make it to where two Democratic districts are together, so you have one Democratic representative as opposed to two, or you carve up portions of those districts, so you kind of siphon off little people here, siphon off people there, so it reduces the influence of certain communities. And what that does from a suppression standpoint is it means that there is not any representative or representatives, who are catering to the issues of certain communities, right? So those communities may be a small percentage, if chopped up, of a legislative district, when collectively, frankly, they could have a much broader voice. So it's been something that's been used in a lot of ways to make sure that you're carving these things up so you can maintain a political majority in state houses, or so you can make sure that you prevent the Democrat to Republican numbers being even as you think about who you might send to Congress, right? So you try to make them maybe a little more red, and I'm certain it happens, and it may happen in blue states too, to make districts more blue. But you do it, and I always say, and this is something that I know another politicians have said, but it really resonates with me, is that voters should pick their politicians, and politicians should not be picking their voters. So, and the way that you do that is to draw fair district lines, and you let the people decide. That's who we are as a country, and that's how we should be. But this happens all across the country, and you can look at some of these states that have these super majorities. A lot of those super majorities are built on gerrymandering districts, and again, that's why you see, like in Georgia and other places where you have big majorities in the state house, but then you send two U.S. senators who are Democrats to Congress, right? That's because those power centers of population and that kind of stuff, their voice has been reduced in the state house, and oftentimes that's done through redistricting.
When we look at, I want to go back to the anti-protest bills and some of the specific language that's included in some of those. One of the interesting aspects of HB1674 in particular, and others like it, suggests that vehicle drivers who exercise what they're calling due care are exempt from penalty if they drive their vehicle into a protest. And my question is that really a reasonable standard? Because I think about, due care when it comes to, there was an interesting article that was talking about, we don't have that same sort of a standard for somebody showing up to a protest armed. Arizona is an open carry state. We had instances where you had a peaceful protest happening for Black Lives Matter, and there were those opposed to that who showed up bearing arms. Right. And so the question is, how is that any different from someone walking into a crowd and firing indiscriminately into that crowd because they felt they exercised due care in addressing a threat to their person? How is that any different than driving into a crowd with a car because you think you're exercising due care for the couple of people around your vehicle who are perceived as a...
I don't think there is much difference, right? But this goes to the overarching point to where there's not an attempt to solve a problem with these pieces of legislation, right? That's not the deal. So like you and I have to, we're thinking deeply and trying to find an answer that just doesn't exist, because the goal was never to solve a problem. The goal was to intimidate, which is the reason why people show up with AR-15s outside of a protest and all that kind of stuff, right? Which is the reason why, these great immunity to drivers, those kind of things exist. As I said before, right, there is not a DA in the country that is going to prosecute a driver who can prove that they felt like their life was at risk and they end up injuring somebody in the street, because we've seen it happen, and it happened in Tulsa this year, right? So there's not a need for this kind of legislation anyway. But what the scenario that you just talked about is exactly what's going to begin to happen, because there are people who are going to be emboldened by these things, and they will use cars as a weapon in the way they might use a gun as a weapon, thinking that they have protection of law. And in some cases, they may frankly have that protection of law, and it does nothing but make our streets more dangerous. It makes when folks are advocating for themselves more dangerous. But I think it makes just our daily interaction, frankly, more dangerous than anything that we're doing, right? And so, like, for me, again, I don't think that there was ever an attempt to solve a problem with these anti-protester bills, because protesting in and of itself is not a problem. What you are doing is you're making it more dangerous for everybody involved. And I would imagine, because these things happen, right, there will be something else that happens in this country that's going to lead to folks taking to the streets. And this is going to be after a wave of these anti-protester bills have hit different parts of the country. There will be somebody believing they have the protection of law, who actually may have the protection of law, who are going to injure and maybe kill folks because they just don't like protesters. Because these bills are designed for people who just don't like protesters. They're not bills designed to solve a problem.
Yeah, there was an interesting call for the possibility of, I know across the country there have been the so-called Karen Acts, which are aimed at, penalizing falsified police reports on a racial basis. And we actually in Flagstaff had a somewhat seemingly short-lived call for the same sort of legislation that would have both made it a penalizable offense to file a false claim on the basis of race, and given some ability to for the victim of that sort of a claim to file for civic penalties in case of that sort of crime against them. And what we saw happen with those sorts of bills, where they were being proposed but not passed, was folks asking that question of, what does it take to prove that it was racially motivated? What keeps somebody from just saying, oh, they called the police on me because I'm Black, that's racist, now I want to sue them. And so because there was seen to be that line where, well, we really can't determine that, a lot of places turned away from filing that sort of a law. So now we look at these sorts of anti-protest laws, and this sort of a clause in particular, where it says if you feel that you are threatened by a protester or a rioter in the midst of a crowd, you can run your car into that crowd because you have a reasonable fear that you are being threatened by this group of protesters. And I want to read off this comment. So someone in a car that is locked is afraid of someone who is standing with a cardboard sign. It's that sort of a difference in how do you determine whether or not that was a reasonable fear. So I wonder, how does a court determine that this person who decided to drive their car into a crowd of protesters because they claim that they felt threatened, how would a court actually go about verifying that sort of a claim?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that we see all the time, right? We see this when, whether, somebody unintentionally hurts or kills somebody. The intent is always something that courts are asking that question about, and this kind of stuff is no different. But I think it brings up an underlying issue, right? Again, I have such an aversion to these pieces of legislation because I know they come from a place to try to intimidate folks who are out there protesting versus trying to solve a legal problem. I mentioned the guy driving the truck in Tulsa, Oklahoma this past year. He was not prosecuted. So they determined that he felt threatened, right? This is pre this piece of legislation. So these are not bills that are designed to fix anything legally, right? These bills are designed to embolden folks who don't like protesters. They're designed to intimidate folks who are protesters. And so, I think court systems and DAs, when they do investigations, they're always trying to consider what intent was, and I think they are very well able to do it without these new wave of laws where we're trying to go after protesters on one end or go after people who are trying to organize protests. I think that's going to be a lot harder to prove, frankly. Somebody who handed out T-shirts, are they culpable of somebody, burns down the building? Like, I wouldn't think so. But the laws that are being passed would suggest that they are very much liable for that kind of stuff, which I think is a far more far-fetched legal standard than what we already have on the books, right? And so, these pieces of legislation actually aren't solving a legal problem. They may be creating a legal problem, but they're not solving a legal problem. Right now, if you feel that you're in danger or being threatened, or you may think that you're in the middle of people and they're going to smash your windows out and that kind of stuff, similar to the behavior that happens after people win championships and all that kind of thing. Like I mentioned before, we see people flipping over cars all the time. You already have the ability to try to protect yourself in those situations. We've seen it be used over and over and over again. So there's that. The thing I do want to just quickly go back to on some of these Karen laws and why they are so important, right? We already know that for whatever reason, oftentimes when law enforcement is called and there's somebody who's being, feel like they're being threatened, particularly by somebody of color, those situations oftentimes get out of hand pretty quickly. We also know the story of Emmett Till, who was said to have whistled at a white woman and was murdered. In Tulsa, we're getting ready to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the race massacre here in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which started with an allegation of a white woman about what a black man did to her in an elevator. It resulted in 300 black folks losing their life here in Tulsa, and Black Wall Street in the Greenwood district, which is the wealthiest black area in the country, being burned to the ground without verification of what happened. In either one of those instances, it cost people their lives. And so these Karen laws, frankly, I think are super duper important because you can't just be calling the cops on folks. A, it's a drain on public resources, but B, those things get out of hand all the time. And so, like, I don't think it's all that hard to prove if somebody did it for no reason, because that's what you find out. Did somebody actually feel threatened or not? Is that why they called the cops? Was there threatening behavior? If there was not threatening behavior, somebody should absolutely be punished for calling police on innocent people, because we know throughout history, people lose their lives oftentimes when they don't. So, for me, I know that folks will give a ton of excuses not to do the right thing. But definitely in the context of the Tulsa Race Massacre, definitely thinking about Emmett Till and the numbers of young black folks who were accused of things and were killed without judge or jury. We definitely need to be taking a harder look at laws that prevent that type of thing from happening.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting parallel in terms of the intent and the intention of that sort of a law and what it does. Because when you parallel them, you have the Karen Act bills that are aimed at deterring or convincing people, you should not make these sort of false allegations. So it's a law that's been written to deter bad behavior.
Right.
And if we apply that same logic to these protesting bills, then the logical leap is that these are bills that are aimed at deterring the bad behavior of
Right.
peaceful protest. And
Definitely.
so I think that's something that our audience really needs to walk away from in this conversation.
That's absolutely right. I mean, it's really interesting, digging in a little bit there. You gave me all the reasons why some of those Karen laws haven't been enacted. I've been given a lot of reasons why we haven't taken up police reform in Oklahoma in a real way, although we have great pieces of legislation modeled after red and blue states. There's always an excuse for those things. But somehow, some way, anti-protester and voter suppression bills find their way to the governor's desk. And if there was not a clearer, show of what intent is and what intentions are, I think that is where it's at, because we could come up with come up with more than 100 reasons. Just if we sat here for the next 30 seconds, went back and forth with a reason why these voter suppression bills, anti-protester bills are awful, and most people would have to agree with this. Most reasonable people have to agree with this. But those are things that cross the finish line. These other issues that we talk about that feed into the broader problem oftentimes never get the light of day, which is the reason why, right, we have to continue to protest. We have to continue to vote because it's clear that so many of those who are stewards of the system currently no longer need to be stewards of that system. But in our context, we're not going to go storm the Capitol and kill a police officer. We're going to continue to do the hard work, hitting the streets, really uniting people, and then showing up on election day, because that's the way in which our ancestors, when people came before us, that's the way they fought to do it. That's the way we're going to fight to do it. And it'd be really nice if we had some more allies who were empowered to make that a little easier for us. But easier or not, I know we'll get there.
Absolutely. I want to give just one more opportunity for you to share anything that you think our audience really needs to know about the nature of these sorts of bills. What do we need to keep in mind? And ultimately, what do we need to do about it? What is our responsibility as the people to work when it comes to, or to do when it comes to these sorts of things?
So my grandfather passed away. My dad's dad passed away this past November, and I was, had the awesome and very difficult responsibility of eulogizing him at his funeral. And the thing that struck me about my grandfather, who passed away at 81 years old, is that he was born in South Texas, less than 100 years after slaves in Texas were notified that they were free on Juneteenth, right? And so enduring what he had to endure just as a young Black man in South Texas, right? My father, who was born in 1962, I'm not mentioning when my mom was born because I don't want her to be upset with me by revealing her age. But my parents were both born before the passage of the Voting Rights and Civil Rights Acts in the 60s. I am the first person in that line who was born at a time where in this country I had on paper equal rights to everybody else. That's something my grandfather didn't have when he was born. It's something my mom didn't have, my mom and dad didn't have when they were born. The lesson there is that it wasn't that long ago, right? It wasn't that long ago that we were fighting for these very basic rights in ways in which we continue to fight today. And when we were fighting, when the people came before us were fighting for it, they were fighting against the same, I'm just quoting, she just let us know she's 59. But when those folks were fighting, they were fighting for the very same things in very similar ways. What was the response to the system then? It was a crackdown on protesters. It was to make voting very difficult. And I think at some point we got comfortable. My generation got comfortable. Maybe my mom's generation got a little comfortable because we had all this progress at one point, right? I think what we're finding now is we still have those same remnants from when my grandfather was young and when my parents were born. And the response to it is our collective responsibility to do just what people did back then. And I would argue it was far tougher for them back then, but they knew what that North Star looked like. And I think we have to continue to march toward that North Star and understand what that means. And know we still have a lot to fight for. Yeah, the environment may be a little bit easier for us, but the obstacles are always going to be there. And until we get to that day where we have not only overcome those obstacles for ourselves, but we've removed those obstacles for the next generation, we have to continue to do the work. And so, again, that work shows up on election day, not just every 4 years, but every time there's something on a ballot. That work shows up in the conversations that we have with friends and counterparts, irrespective of race. I'm one, and I guarantee you talk to some of my colleagues in the legislature who I disagree with. I'm one to come and talk to you straight up about stuff and tell you how I feel about it. It is okay to have conflict and still, retain relationships, right? So quiet doesn't get you anywhere. The quieter we are about stuff, the longer things will remain the same. So for the folks watching and anybody who might watch the recording, I think the thing for us to understand is all the things that we were inspired by for the folks who came before, that is still the work left for us to do. And we can't get too comfortable because we get to a great place professionally or financially. We got to understand that the road toward progress continues on, and we have to do our part.
All right. And I understand Reverend Lewis also has one last question before we close out.
Sure.
And you kind of just touched on it, Brother Representative, but I really want you to take us out with a final answer on why state legislative races are so vital. Please, can you, I just don't think that we can stress that enough. And so if you would please use these final moments of the program to get that message across to the viewers.
Absolutely. And I'll even pull in a couple of examples. Medicaid expansion, big policy change in DC back during the Obama years. 10 years later, for 10 years, our state legislature refused to expand Medicaid, largely because of Barack Obama. And so we had folks in our state who couldn't get health coverage because Republicans in Oklahoma didn't like Barack Obama, right? Those were state legislators and governors that made that decision, right? So they decided that they hated Barack Obama more than they loved the health of their citizens. Rural hospitals closed, all that kind of stuff because of decisions made by state legislators. The same goes with the voting laws we talked about. Those decisions made by state legislators. How your kid's school gets funded is a decision made by state legislators. The criminal code in your state, right? Criminal justice reform is a big issue. What's a felony? What's a misdemeanor? All that stuff. Those decisions are made by state legislators in your state. And so if you think for 1 second that Joe Biden is going to have a greater impact on your life than the Speaker of the House in your state house, you just don't understand the system well enough. You don't understand the system well enough. The power you give to state elected officials makes a greater difference in your life than just about anywhere else. And so if you don't get to work on those state legislative races, I don't care who the president is in D.C. I don't care who the most powerful member of Congress is in D.C. or the most powerful senator is in D.C. That just won't matter. All the decisions that most greatly impact your life are made in state houses and things that run across a governor's desk. And so I believe, and it's not just because I'm in the state house, but I believe they're the most important races that we have in this country because, again, they can flip the way in which you can vote and flip presidential elections and Senate races. But more importantly, what's legal, what's illegal? How is that administrative justice going to be carried out? People think that only presidents appoint judges. Governors do too. So like all those things are super duper important. And there's been so many states, frankly, that have not had the progress, not benefited from big federal programs because of the tone of the politics in the state, right? And I think that's why, state legislative races are incredibly important because those are the folks who have the greatest impact on your life, your kid's life. Frankly, anybody you come in contact with, they have a greater impact on that life than just about anybody else.
Thank you so much for answering that. And thank you, Miss Sister Resident Facilitator, for letting me come in today and ask these questions. I just have one last question for Brother Representative, and that would be, when will you be running for senator?
Oh, hey, you know what? I love House District 72. I love representing folks here. I have no interest in doing anything other than that. But I'll say this. I always say you never want to look past your next election. And I tell anybody who comes to me who's considering running for office, maybe the two of you might be thinking about it. If you believe that you have something to offer, and you believe that you're not being represented the way that you wish you were, I always say, take a shot at it. The reason is because we also force change that way. So I don't know about the Senate anytime soon, but what I do know is I look forward to continuing to work with my colleagues in the Oklahoma House Democratic Caucus, and frankly my colleagues across the aisle in the House, and seeing if we can't do some positive things for people in Oklahoma, and hopefully have that be something that other states decide to take up across the country as well.
Well, the LBE thinks that you are absolutely brilliant. We think that about your mother, and so we did not expect anything less from you. And you came and you gave it to us today, and we are very appreciative of how you are serving your state. And we thank you for coming in today and enlightening and informing and educating us today on this hot topic. So thank you. And with that being said, Madam Facilitator, back over to you.
All right. Well, yes, I want to echo that thanks. Thank you so much, Representative Nichols, for joining us today. And we also want to thank our audience for joining and participating and watching along with us and learning along with us today. We're going to close out, as we always do, with our sharing of what's coming up next for this group. So our next session will be 1.5 million Black men missing, examining the impact that mortality, population health, mass imprisonment, and social inequality has on Black men in America. That session will be on Wednesday, April 21st at 6 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, that's Arizona time. And our speaker that day will be Dr. Brian L. Sykes, Associate Professor of Criminology, Law, and Society at the University of California, Irvine. So we invite you to join us again on that Wednesday, April 21st at 6 p.m. Mountain Standard Time for that upcoming session. The Live Black experience is dedicated to fully engaging the community in all aspects of the lived Black experience and facilitating community dialogues regarding it that lead to mutual understanding, respect, and reconciliation. We are housed in the historic Murdoch Community Center, which is located on the site of the old Dunbar Elementary School. Dunbar was desegregated almost 2 years prior to Brown versus the Board of Education, and the school system here was held up by the NAACP nationally as a model for education. By taking a few minutes to complete the survey, you are helping us to continue to provide the community with relevant and timely programming. As always, if you enjoy the programming brought to you by the Murdoch Community Center, we ask you to consider helping us continue that work with a monetary donation. You can do so by going to the link below or scanning the QR code on your screen. We remind you that the Southside Community Association is a nonprofit 501c3 organization, and we thank you in advance for your generous donations. In closing, again, we want to say thank you to all those who have engaged with us today. Thank you again, extreme thanks to Representative Nichols for educating us, for informing us of the nature of these laws that we all need to be aware of, and educating us in why our election processes are so important and why we should all be engaged in those processes and looking at these laws, understanding what they mean, and doing what we can to make impact where and when we can. By protest if necessary, despite even these laws that try and tell us that that is not the right thing to do, when we know that it is our way to make that sort of an impact. So we thank you again to our audience for joining us today. We wish you a wonderful remainder of your weekend. We hope that you will join us again in the future. And as always, we close out by saying, be blessed and be well. Thank you.